Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on local data sovereignty. It's great to have you all join us for what I expect will be a challenging but certainly informative discussion. My name is Arnie Saiki, and I am a member of the IF20 Environmental Working Group, and I'll be your moderator. This is an hour-long webinar, and I hope this is enough time to introduce the theme of what local data sovereignty is. There's a lot to unpack in these three words as we um, come to try to understand what is local, what is data, and what is sovereignty. And hopefully, after our discussion, we might find that what we are looking at is to some degree a reimagined future for our collective or mutually collective approach towards global governance. I'd like to thank our panelists for being here, Hugh, Robert, Lorna, and Aram. I will introduce you in a couple of minutes and then throw you a question that I hope will start this discussion off with a bang. For our audience, we encourage you to use the chat feature to post your questions as they arise during the discussion. We have Mariana Richardson, our Director of Communication, in the background, fielding your questions, and we will do our best to address them towards the end. So let me begin. In today's world, where data is often termed the new oil, the handling and control of data can significantly influence social, economic, and political landscapes. However, the governance of data frequently lacks the moral framework that interfaith dialogue can provide, particularly in protecting the interests of marginalized communities. This oversight can lead to the exploitation of local data without the consent or benefit of the people it represents. So today's discussion on local data sovereignty is about the right of communities to control their data. And this is not merely a technical matter, but one of fairness, representing cultural, environmental, and spiritual values fundamental to these communities. We have a panel of experts who will explore these issues. So I'll start with their introductions. Hugh Govan is deeply involved in the Pacific region, working with the locally managed marine area network to enhance indigenous and community livelihoods. He's an honorary member of the Indigenous and Community Conserved Area Consortium and an adjunct senior fellow at the University of the South Pacific's School of Law and Social Sciences. He has contributed significantly to regional ocean policies like Fiji's Ocean Policy Framework. His expertise is essential for this discussion, ensuring that data management aligns with community needs and Indigenous knowledge. Robert Ford is the Senior Technical and Policy Advisor at Telecommunications Management Group, Inc., and a respected figure in the ICT sector, focusing on telecommunications policy. He also teaches at the Kobe Institute of Computing and leads the Rwanda Software Testing Qualification Board, promoting global technology standards and education. His work is pivotal in advocating for the protection of community and personal digital rights. Lorna Q. Israel is an assistant professor at Miriam College and a faculty associate at the Women and Gender Institute, with over 2 decades in international and gender studies. As president of the Philippine International Studies Organization and vice president of the Philippine Middle East Studies Association, her advocacy offers a pathway to empower marginalized communities and poverty reduction strategies. Dr. Aram Sinnreich serves as the chair of communication studies at American University School of Communication, where he explores the intersections of technology, law, and culture. His recent work includes The Secret Life of Data. It's a new book that's focusing on data societal roles. Among insights, Aram's insights offer a strong critique against data hegemony and, of course, contribute significantly to this issue. So welcome, everyone. I want to first begin by exploring a provocative concept. I want to talk about ancestral bones as more than historical artifacts, something that is cumulative, a past, present, future, something that has cultural and spiritual legacy, connecting us to our ancestors, as well as, I would argue, to our future generations. Our ancestral bones symbolize deep-rooted knowledge and ecological insight. And for some, the bones of our ancestors provide us with a kind of invaluable spiritual guidance. This reverence for our um, ancestral bones in interfaith parallels the sanctity of religious relics, and which means that these are sacred, sacrosanct, and we cannot put a monetary value on them or capitalize upon them in financial markets. How should we approach the pursuit of natural capital or carbon market schemes that seek to monetize that which is sacred or sacrosanct? So my first question to you all is to get a sense of whether this epistemological exploration around bones is applicable to how we can come to understand the value of our ecological data and the value that data potentially provides for indigenous, marginalized, or other impacted peoples. So who would like to begin? Or should I pick someone? All right. Well, since no one's raising their hand, I'll pick Aram since he's nodding his head.
That's a great question to jump us in. Um, Ironically, the book that you mentioned that I just published, The Secret Life of Data, one of the geneses for that book was I was walking around an ancient Jewish graveyard in the Czech Republic about 6 years ago. And, I'm of Jewish ancestry, and my grandfather was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire near what's now the Czech Republic. And I remember thinking, here are all these collapsed gravestones. Nobody's tended to the site except for treating it as a kind of folkloric tourist destination for, at least since World War II. And yet there's so much data here. There's the data on the headstones. There are the forensic genetic data available from, the remains, and there are all kinds of other data. And it occurred to me that at some point in the not too distant future, a lot of those data will be collected, analyzed, stored in an online database, and made accessible to certain people with certain kinds of expertise and means. And that was one of the insights that started me down the journey of writing this book, The Secret Life of Data, which is really about how we can't predict what is going to be datafied and by whom, and what kinds of long-term knowledge is going to be produced from those data, given new forensic techniques, newly powerful computers, by people very far distant from the site. And ironically, shortly before this webinar, I'm considering trying to get European citizenship based on my grandfather's birth there. And I was looking through online scans of paper birth records from 1914 when my grandfather was born in that region. And a lot of them were not kept very well and have been, it's very easy to find Christian children who were born in the town that my grandfather was born in 1914, but not at all easy to find Jewish children. And that points to the kind of inherent epistemological disjuncture in our data collection practices, right? So if you connect these two episodes, the practice of collecting data seems like an objective one, and it seems like it benefits everybody equally. But the kinds of questions that we ask, the kinds of data that we collect, and the manner in which we make them available or not carry profound geopolitical and cultural implications that have moral dimensions to them. And it's very easy for me, given my my ancestry with this marginalized group in this particular region, to see how the data regimes don't benefit me in a direct way when they may benefit others. It's a lot clearer when you look at even more extreme examples. One of the stories we tell in our book, In the Secret Life of Data, is about the exhumation of bones of enslaved people in Maryland, where I live now, in Maryland in the US, who were only dug up because they wanted to build a highway there. And for about 35 years, these bones just kind of sat in a box somewhere. And then eventually a researcher said, why don't we use modern techniques to kind of figure out what the living conditions of these people were? And they discovered all kinds of long buried secrets, including like the white parentage of an enslaved child buried with his mother, terrible working conditions and zinc poisoning and physical deformations among the people who worked on the site. And so I guess the short answer is that humanity has a lot to gain by re-examining human remains, but if we do so without actively considering the disparate consequences it's going to have for more powerful and less powerful communities, then the kinds of knowledge that ultimately do get produced from those analyses are going to only serve the interests of power and are going to further disempower people who have already been written out of the history books and left off of the property rolls.
Well, thank you. Does anybody want to jump in, or should I maybe Lorna? Yeah, I think you've raised your hand. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question, which reminds me actually of the debate of whether housework should be paid, in as much as it was being pointed out by feminists and gender advocates that it's as important as the work or the paid work being done by men. I think the argument still, it's still alive because people cannot put a value to it except to say that it is valuable, even if it is non-monetized or without a cash equivalent. But the question of monetizing or putting a monetary value is a bit tricky, and I'm interested in exploring, because in many ways, for example, like the natural capital, it is in one way or the other being monetized. So for example, in the Philippines, if floods, this hot weather or the El Nino, the government would put a price to it. 3 million crops have been destroyed. Fire, the cost of fire was 4 million pesos, etc. So I think on that point, it's a symbolic way of alerting people on the value, on the monetary value vis-a-vis the symbolic or the cultural value of something that had been lost. And I think by putting a value to that, people get aware, oh, so that's how important it was. So that's how much we've lost, and that's how much we should recover. My cat is joining this webinar. Okay, just listen, okay? So I think that's one way. And it reminds me actually of this group where I am involved, in data monitoring, in cultural preservation. And I think I'd like to now see what is the value of our group, because most of us are volunteer, and the objective is the name of the group is Grupo Kalinangan, or Cultural Preservation. So it gets funding, small funding from the government, from the private sector, but most of us are volunteers in terms of teaching, especially the local communities, on how to do cultural mapping. So I think the monetary value puts a value. How much is it worth? The work and the objective that it wants to attain. So if I were paid, for example, how much would I get out of that involvement? So on the one hand, the money scheme about the thing, puts a value and alerts people to the importance. But on the other hand, is the value fair enough? But I think the end of the day, because it will be digitalized or it will be put in some repository, I would have a problem if I want to access the data stored, if I will be asked to pay, or my access would be limited, but I can have unlimited access for as long as I paid a certain amount. So that's how I would like to see it. So it puts a value, people will be alerted to it, but at the end of the day, is it really given or really shared? Because if we would like to go back to the origin of data, meaning it's given, so it implies that it should also be freely shared.
Thank you, Lorna. Robert?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this is a great it's a great question, like my colleague Aram already mentioned. And I come from a background, a more technical computer data background, where we recognize today that data has always existed. People, we have always had data defining people from time. The form and nature of data has evolved over generations up to today, where we have what we classify as digital data, which is computer generated data. And this brings in a concept of who should own data, who should access data, who should consume data, and for what purpose should data be classified or positioned for consumption by our human nature. When we get to the crossroads of open data, data sovereignty, and data security, we are faced with a situation where we need a multifaceted approach in making sure that the data that is prevalent that we have today benefits humanity. Now, coming to your question, where you related this data to ancestry and what exists today in terms of bonds, for example, like you said, and how that could affect marginalized communities. I come from a country with a recent history of genocide. It's not 30 years ago. It's about 30 years ago now, where Rwanda as a country went through the horror of genocide. Coming from that background, we live in society today where some of the agents of this genocide still live in countries around the world. Genocide, as you know, is a crime against humanity that is planned and put in practice by a group of people. It could be political, could be it could be social, it could be of any form, but a group of people plan and execute a genocide, and they have an intention and purpose to wipe out a race. When so I come from a country that has experienced this. When you have some of the remains from the victims of this genocide preserved in certain places, and then you still have people who committed the genocide, who even could potentially be having a name and purpose to actually continue to finish what they started. In the center of this situation, you have data. Who should access data in this context? And how should we protect that data so that the purpose and aim of completing a genocidal purpose is constrained by rightful thinking members of society. At this point, we get to a point where the issue and elements of data become critical, and where discussions about how data is used is supposed to be put on a table of rightful thinking members of communities and societies and governments, and look at access to this data with critical critical alertness and attention to make sure that wrong elements of our societies and communities do not access critical data that could facilitate and enable them to continue to commit a crime against humanity. So when we craft these policies and regulatory frameworks about open data, we need to be able to say this open data or these types of data sets can only be available to the world for these specific purposes. And around that, we build a firewall that guards this data to be used correctly. So that if it's not used within the confines that we have defined, then there should be apprehension of these communities that could be using it for wrong purposes. But going beyond that, you have, for example, in my country, genocide memorials across the country, many of them, where you walk through and have these bones, talking about bones, and you have these bones right there, right in front of you. They have forensic evidence of who these bones belong to, who are these people. There is typical forensic evidence about these people. And they're accessed by anybody. Now, it becomes a wrong societal moral when this information available in open domain is even used for commercial reasons. Then you come back to the generations and say, how sad could this happen that the bones of my ancestors that left this world not of their goodwill or not of natural reasons, but were killed while being used for commercial reasons and commercial purposes. There now brings in the concept of data sovereignty. Who should own data? Moving from open data, but on data sovereignty, who should use own data, and what are the limits of ownership must these people have to make sure that data sovereignty is properly protected? And then you get the elements of personal data, data security, making sure that as an individual, not as a state, I own the data that is to me, that belongs to me. How do we protect children from, for example, online data that they have not willingly put online, but people of more mature judgment have put online and have made these children victims of exposure to the world that could be harsh or that could be dangerous to them. So all these concepts need to be put into, all these ideas need to be put into context as we discuss the elements of open data, data security, and data sovereignty, so the world sees it, so that we harmonize an approach towards how we see this data and how we can properly use it to benefit humanity.
Okay, thank you so much, Robert. That was very sobering. Hugh, can you pass?
Yes, no, I was just going to draw more from my practical experience, and as you mentioned earlier, in the Pacific, particularly Western Melanesia, with about 1,000 different ethnic groups, some 7,000-8,000 communities, perhaps. Most, 80% live in rural areas, and they're particularly excluded from the global market economy. So ways of benefiting from their immense sort of cultural and traditional diversity would be very welcome. The bones or ancestral angle is a very interesting one. I'll explain slightly why. Because the typical interventions for administration of services, natural resource management, but also disaster risk reduction, water supply, community development, climate change more and more nowadays, implemented by governments, also quite often by NGOs, work at a very focused, kind of Western focused level, going into communities, asking what the situation is, what the problems are, and proposing or encouraging communities to think of solutions. Sometimes external ideas are brought in. The norm is that these approaches skim very lightly over local indigenous cultural matters, and they usually get straight to the subject matter. Here's a pipe, plug it in and you get water, kind of thing. But regardless of that, a lot of local data gets put in play, and it will be coming out in reports or maybe coming out in photographs or whatever. The raising the matter of data sovereignty using such a sacred and usually shielded from outsiders example as ancestral issues or bones particularly would be a striking way of illustrating or drawing attention to the importance of the data that people hold that maybe they don't, quite often in fact, they don't even value very much anymore. The question would be, in terms of this service delivery, which is getting some of the basics to communities, whether this would be valuable or detrimental needs consideration. And if it actually reduces the interaction with these immediate and not very frequent actually service deliveries, and causing communities to be a bit more circumspect about dealing with water supply or sanitation or forest management, then it could be negative. So it would have to be deployed rather carefully. But as I say, it does strike me that you certainly get people's attention, and so it might be a way of explaining what otherwise is quite a dense conversation on data sovereignty. That's my initial thoughts.
Well, thank you. So now I'm going to move to to a much easier question. After having had that exchange, how can local data sovereignty help empower communities while ensuring their cultural and spiritual values are respected? Actually, before I ask that question, let me just backpedal a little bit and let me ask, would any of you like to respond to what everyone had said, in this panel? Or should I move on to the second question? Okay, so how can local data sovereignty help empower communities while ensuring their cultural and spiritual values are respected? Who would like to address this first? Okay, Robert, you're smiling.
Okay, I'm more than happy to go first. Thank you. I think that's a great question. I think when we look at the example, creating ICT strategies that balance local data rights with global interoperability and fairness, I think this requires a multifaceted approach that involves a great number of people that range from government to international organizations and other stakeholders. And I have a few considerations that I think we can look at in context. One would be promotion of, for example, open data standards. Governments and international organizations, I mean, civil society and people who have policy formulation in their custody and in their docket should promote the adoption of open data standards for data exchange, and so that you are able to prevent what we'd call like vendor lock-in to ensure level playing ground. But this is specifically for good purposes of promoting human understanding in terms of what data can be able to provide. And also there needs to be, number two, on a regional level, because countries are placed in regions around the world. If we could have a cross-border data governance framework so that countries have a common table where they sit to agree on specific frameworks in which data access can be available, but at the same time, critical data can be protected for the benefit of all these countries. I look at also the element of multi-stakeholder engagement, like I said at the beginning. Collaboration should involve not only governments and international bodies, but also other stakeholders, including civil society organizations, industry associations, academia, for example, and the private sector. Because multi-stakeholder dialogue identify common challenges and then share best practices and foster consensus on ICT strategies that would enable data controllers to have a collective approach towards safety, security, and sovereignty of data, so that you do not have specific groups of people and communities marginalized or having their data just open and accessed and used for whatever reasons that could even be inappropriate. We also, I think, need to have an approach at a more global data sharing agreement framework, where globally we look at nations and continents having standards that allow them to agree on how data can be used and secure marginalized communities and societies. Governments and international bodies could negotiate, for example, bilateral and multilateral agreements to facilitate the sharing of data for specific purposes, such as, public health, scientific research, or, disaster response in that case. And these agreements should include provisions for data protection and security and privacy to ensure that sensitive information is handled appropriately. I think by adopting these strategies and fostering greater collaboration among government and international bodies, it's possible to create a framework for local data rights while promoting global interoperability and fairness in this particular digital age. That would be my take on that question.
Okay, please. I think everyone should jump in and respond to Robert, because I think I think what he laid out was so fundamental to how we generally begin to look at how data is being constructed on a global stage.
I agree entirely with Robert that there needs to be a multilateral set of agreements that govern how local and sovereign data rights are treated on the world stage. As Robert would probably agree, the devil is in the details, right? So the closest analogy we probably have from a policy standpoint is intellectual property. And if you look at global IP regimes, what's known as TRIPS, the TRIPS agreements of the mid-1990s, and the kind of world that we've lived in since then, those systems of IP, including both copyright and trademark, and to a certain extent patent, are structured in a way that empowers so-called Western wealthy nations and disempowers people living elsewhere in the world, in poorer nations or in nationless communities or indigenous communities. And a lot of that comes down to what counts as property and what doesn't, right? So in the case of trademark or patent or copyright, for instance, there are requirements to claim ownership over a piece of knowledge, that it has to be new, that it has to be the work of an individual or a specific group of individuals, that it has to be original, that is to say, not overly dependent on pre-existing forms of knowledge. And that all applies, you can argue that all applies when it comes to like a new novel or a new film, although we'd all say, you know, we've been to the theater and seen that film before. But it doesn't apply when it comes to a lot of forms of traditional knowledge, whether you're talking about indigenous medicines or whether you're talking about folkloric art forms. And there's been a lot of very heated dispute in these multilateral treaty organizations about how can localized knowledge be protected from exploitation when the very definition of property is antagonistic to the understanding of knowledge within those localized communities. And I'm very concerned that the same thing is going to be true when it comes to the propertization of data and any data rights that might accrue from that. So there have been some interesting efforts already to create frameworks. Robert mentioned some of them. There have been some technological interventions. There was a project about 5 or 10 years ago called the Indigenous Knowledge Graph. And its whole purpose was to correct for the Western biases in existing data systems and AI systems that would oversample, for instance, data from European and American corpuses and undersample data from elsewhere, so that whenever you know, ChatGPT or DALL-E or what have you is asked to represent, you know, for instance, a member of an indigenous culture, it resorts to stereotype because the number of indigenous sources in the machine learning data set are so few. So the whole purpose of this indigenous knowledge graph was to be like an extra technological module that could be incorporated into AI systems built in the US or in Europe, so that they wouldn't have to, so that they wouldn't be limited by their own cultural blinders. And that project died because nobody wanted to invest in it because there's no money in developing expertise surrounding the cultural data of indigenous and local communities, right? So unless we find another funding model, and unless we find a more equitable propertization model, any efforts to create data rights based on property rights are going to compound the existing power divides between wealthy nations and everybody else on the planet. So I'm very I wouldn't say skeptical, but my optimism is incredibly cautious when it comes to those kinds of solutions. I do think there's a lot to be said about curating and maintaining localized databases, and there's an interesting model that Jesse and I talk about in our book, in the Secret Life of Data, for the construction of AI systems and other data systems that use what we call triangulation, which is to say it's a whole new epistemology of AI that instead of kind of one actor with one point of view collecting all of these data and spitting out a kind of godlike vision of the world from on high, you can actually collect multiple conflicting forms of data coded in different ways and then present them in a layered way that is multivocal and multi-perspectival. And there are some great examples of this in the world of citizen science, probably some of the stuff that Hugh has worked on, stuff like FathomNet, stuff like the Global Fireball Observatory, where, you know, thousands of citizen scientists upload their own data and metadata to fuel efforts to understand kind of global scale phenomena, whether we're talking about asteroids entering the atmosphere or, you know, the desalination or acidification of the ocean. So there's a lot of interventions out there, but there's not a silver bullet. there's not like one recommendation that's going to solve these problems. And sadly, like so many other issues when it comes to data and power, it really comes down to fixing the larger geopolitical problems that systematically disempower local and indigenous communities in all other respects, right? None of those rights, I mean, let's put it this way. Local communities and indigenous communities on paper enjoy all kinds of rights that in practice are not actually observed or respected. And that's because they have no mechanism to enforce those rights, either through trade agreements or through military might or through, border protection or cultural protection. But then when you look at a wealthy nation like France and how successful it's been in, cultural protectionism, it's very, like we're not allowed to call it champagne unless it comes from the Champagne region of France, right? It becomes very clear that even these mechanisms that are being proposed themselves are not equally enforceable across the range of global societies.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, as Aram was telling the story about the project that collapsed because there was no funding, I totally agree with that. Actually, I missed going to the community and doing participatory research. For a time, there was huge funding for that, or at least sufficient funding, to go to the community, do participatory research, relate to them, or devote back to them the data. And then suddenly it disappeared. And actually, we're looking now, where are the researchers? Why aren't people going to the community, asking them for what their needs are? So we have that kind of, and I think that's one of the trends, defunding projects that are more community oriented, that are, that you have to immerse with the community. So, and most of us now are reliant on this so-called big data, on statistics that we cannot understand, or we don't have a nuance of the story behind these statistics. And I think the problem or situation now, because of this monetization scheme, like for the Philippines, we have undergone the so-called privatization program, where public properties or public goods have been put into the private hands. So once it's put into the private hands, then the access becomes restricted, and only the top officials or the top officers of the corporation now define how to go about our lives. So I think one of the, in terms of sustainability, I'm now scared of my own group where I'm involved, because it's a very good project. As I said, it's reliant on our voluntary spirit. It gets a little bit of funding from the government and a little bit of funding from this private sector, private companies that are interested in preserving the cultural heritage of the Philippines and putting it in digital form. So what happens now if the funding stops? So that's one area that we need to talk about. But at the end of it, but this one also needs money. How do you now empower the community, teach them the skills, make available to them the technologies, how to connect them to the internet, how to access. So at the end of it, we have that that situation where we need the money, we need the funding to keep it going and to keep it sustainable. But at the end of it, I think the government defines now what is the priority. If the government says it's no longer our development priority, then it has to stop. But so we have a way of, we must devise a way or a model where we can continue the project of making sure that the data, the data sovereignty principle is observed, but at the same time get a funding model that does not rely on the private sector, but I see it now that the private sector would need their involvement as well in the project. But we also need to debate between the property rights, which privatize data, and the need to argue that digital resources are a public good. Maybe we could generate more advocates or supporters along that line.
Oh. Robert?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that was a great point that Lorna has made, and I think let's be real here. The speed at which technology and technological evolution is happening in today's time is much faster than the world has been in the past, and because of that, you find that the different stakeholders involved in this whole data politics and social setting are themselves not aware, or they get too much for them to be able to be accountable for, and this is a very big challenge. A couple of months ago, I returned from attending a global internet governance forum last October in Kyoto, in Japan, where the G7 countries had just concluded a meeting in Tokyo, actually, where they were discussing about how to come up with a regulatory framework for artificial intelligence. So there's a common understanding of nations on how to manage artificial intelligence. But they are coming at a time when we have been living with artificial intelligence for decades over. It's been with us. If we are trying to come up with regulation today, so many things could have gone wrong for the period of time that artificial intelligence has been with us. When we look at predictive text, when you're typing and then there's a prediction of what you're going to type next, and then you can just insert that without writing all that, that's artificial intelligence. We've had this since 2008, 2009, 2011, when we started having smart technology. Facial recognition, for example, for security and airports and everything, we've had this for some time. And nations are now standing up to say, oh, we need to create a regulatory framework. So if there was a breach within this period of time when the regulation was not in place, how do you enforce accountability at this point? Something could have already gone terribly wrong. So in my view, I think there needs to be an approach towards how we can equitably look at what is it that has been done. We sit on the table and say, let's conduct a baseline. Look at what has been done. Look at what there is that we can be able to do, but also look at consideration for the speed at which this technology is bombarding us, and be able to have a framework through which we can be able to look at an oversight and say, in this period of time, we can be able to do this. So there needs to be international cooperation, which means collaboration among governments, international organizations, and people that to address global nature of data sovereignty issues. International agreements and standards should recognize the rights of marginalized communities to control the data and provide mechanisms for cross-border enforcement. But also the idea of establishing a monitoring and accountability mechanism to ensure compliance, because data sovereignty needs compliance. And this may include, like regular audits and reporting requirements and, independent oversight bodies to investigate and make sure that the complaints and whatever is coming as a default can be penalized appropriately. I think this is critical. So because technology is moving so fast, it's not we are human beings, we are consuming it, we are generating it. But as we sit down on tables to discuss these things, it is even moving faster. And especially with the fourth industrial revolution technologies like AI, blockchain, we are moving every day with gadgets in our hands where machine learning is able, the applications that, the software that we create is capable to train some of the apps that we have on our phones to be able to predetermine decisions that we make with gadgets that we have in our hands. This is super exponential speed for some of the marginalized communities to comprehend. And so there needs to be a really steadfast approach towards how we ensure that there is maximum safety for the data we consume today for us and for generations to come.
Yes, thank you, Robert. Something that you had said in there in terms of multinational or multilateral, regulatory approaches, and I wanted to bring Hugh into this discussion really quickly and ask him how this local data sovereignty practices could be integrated into the management of fisheries and marine protected areas to better reflect and utilize indigenous methodologies and knowledge systems, as I think it applies to this, to what you and Lorna were discussing earlier. Hugh, please.
Okay, thanks. Yes. Well, I think that comes up quite often, and it's quite frustrating, is that a knee-jerk response to when we raise the importance of local knowledge, local ecological knowledge, traditional knowledge and management systems, a normal response is, oh, it must be recorded before it's lost. And I'm particularly concerned about that because of its risk. If there's anything really valuable there, it will be recorded in platforms that are still better understood and under the control of outsiders. So it will be pretty much giving it away. An approach I've been involved in over decades now, and one I would favor, is to facilitate survival of such knowledge for the moment through traditional means or slightly updated traditional means, e.g. Elders passing on to the youth, supporting elder youth co-development, etc. I mean, there were, back in the 90s, I worked on shamans, apprentices type approaches. I was a marine biologist. I had no idea what things in the jungle were, but it wasn't the point. The main thing is to facilitate the exchange, and in fact, the less I understood what was going on, perhaps the better. So that would ensure that the local data knowledge is used for discussion, is kept inside the community, and when, for example, setting up marine protected areas or natural resource management, at least they are referred to it to see if there's anything they would like to draw on for setting up their own futures and resilience. But we, of course, we have to be, try to not to rein in our inquisitive. Secondly, an approach that I found important, not sufficient in itself, but vital, is to set up protocol, standards, social contracts, or principles of engagement, especially if you're coming from outside, but probably also for people to be more aware of internally. For example, under the locally managed marine area approach, we used a social contract from the beginning, but more recently, small-scale fishers have stipulated similar things in the rules of conduct. This is about how local information, local messaging should be handled, and people coming in to supposedly help should be held to account against this. It's also educational. It raises the awareness of outsiders and about the issues to do with local data and knowledge. And hopefully, and I think in practice, it reduces inadvertent leaks or sharing of information without sort of due consideration. However, it's not strong against really concerted attempts or powerful interests trying to actually pervert the system. So it needs to be explored in terms of how can we actually do more than just voluntary self-enforcement. Who could be the arbiter? Who might you refer to if you think an abuse is being perpetrated? And unfortunately, that often falls to me. In fact, my experience is that most indigenous peoples in the Pacific are nicer than me, and so are more likely to be acquiescent when being taken advantage of, and so quite often I'm the one who squeals first. So that's a bit of a challenge. finally, I'd say another area, particularly in the Pacific, is that communities in many countries already have either informal or formal recognized tenure rights, that is, rights over their land and quite often nearshore waters. They've been messed around with by the imposition of Western legal systems since independence or before independence even, but they still exist in most cases in people's minds and in many actually in the Constitution and the law. How and these rights in areas which are receiving very little government support, these rights are crucial to resilience or sustainable development, and they're relatively under-recognized and being eroded passively by just the accumulation of more laws, or by design, because you can't actually commercialize properties that are under traditional ownership so easily. So finally on that, and coming back to the data, I think the tenure rights, just in whatever way they're called, they are misrepresented through a Western lens. And in fact, tenure rights include the knowledge and information that has passed down through generations about what is allowed to be done or who can do it in those areas. And so a first step would be to make sure that we are particularly sensitive to ensure that tenure right systems are given much more credibility as a resource, as something that should be defended and shouldn't be eroded, and making sure that when we talk about communities' assets, that's one of the first ones, and not just the usual, it's biodiversity or cute customs or whatever. So that would be my short answer. Thanks.
Okay, that was great. I can't believe that the time has gone by so quickly. Okay, we have 4 minutes left. We're going to do a speed 1 minute concluding remark, and I'll figure out what to do about audience questions. Robert, you first. 1 minute.
Thank you very much. I think data and all its forms and nature is important for us, for communities of the world, to be able to thrive and to be able to succeed. But we need a multilateral, multifaceted approach towards how we can protect it, towards how we can preserve it, towards how we can provide access to that data, and make sure that it is data that is working for us and for communities of this world, than the data that could destroy and make human race become extinct.
Okay, thank you. Lorna, 1 minute.
I think I'd like to emphasize that apart from data sovereignty, we should also argue and advocate for technology sovereignty. So, for example, given the geopolitical tensions, there are suspicions, if it is a Western or Chinese origin-based technology, especially in the Philippines, we're a bit worried and anxious of Chinese-based technologies, maybe it's spying on us, etc. So I think we need that. We need to combine the two, because data now is also technology-driven, in as much as technology is data-driven.
Okay. Thank you. Aram, 1 minute.
I think the quest to control the flow of data is quixotic, and what we really need to focus on is the disparate social impacts and potential social harms of various uses of data, and to create strong international treaties and governance systems that discourage powerful actors from exploiting the data that they do collect in ways that have the greatest documentable harm.
Thank you. And Hugh, I'll give you the last minute.
No, just to second Aram's point there, but also I think Arthur Dahl made a point on in the question and answers about ways of operationalizing it, particularly so that people that genuinely wish to share information are not forced into a neoliberal, oh, let's only share it if we're paid sort of thing, when they weren't intending to do that. Thanks.
All right, well, we have a few seconds. Thank you all so much for engaging in this and for putting up with all of my nonsensical questions earlier on. And I want to really thank IF20 for allowing us to use this platform to host this webinar. And I guess the time is up, and it's time to say Very well, thank you. I don't know of any last minute follow-up house cleaning, house messing things that I need to provide, but I will email you all individually when this is done. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.